World War Z was released in 2013 and featured an impressive ensemble cast led by Brad Pitt, whose performance helped transform what could have been a conventional zombie film into a globe-spanning disaster thriller. At the time of production, Pitt was already one of Hollywood's biggest and most respected stars, having established himself through films such as Legends of the Fall, Seven, Fight Club, Ocean's 11, Troy, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, and Moneyball. He had earned a reputation for balancing blockbuster entertainment with thoughtful dramatic performances. His role as Gerry Lane required a different type of hero than audiences were accustomed to seeing. Rather than portraying an unstoppable action figure, Pitt played an intelligent investigator whose greatest strengths were his experience, calm thinking under pressure, and determination to protect his family. His grounded performance became the emotional anchor of the film and allowed audiences to connect with the worldwide catastrophe on a personal level. Brad Pitt was also one of the film's producers through a production company, Plan B Entertainment. This meant his involvement extended far beyond acting. Throughout the difficult production, Pitt remained committed to improving the story even when significant rewrites and expensive reshoots became necessary. Many major productions collapsed under such pressure, but Pitt's influence helped keep the project moving forward despite constant reports of production problems. His willingness to revisit large portions of the movie demonstrated his commitment to delivering a stronger final product rather than settling for an unfinished vision. The commercial success of World War Z further strengthened Pitt's reputation as both a dependable leading actor and an influential producer capable of overseeing ambitious productions on an international scale. Playing Gerry's wife Karen Lane was Mireille Enos, an actress who had gained widespread attention through her acclaimed performance in the television crime drama The Killing. Before World War Z, Enos had built a respected career in theater and television, earning praise for emotionally complex characters rather than blockbuster roles. Her portrayal of Karen avoided making the character merely a helpless spouse waiting to be rescued. Instead, Karen became an emotional support system for Gerry, while simultaneously protecting their daughters during the global crisis. Although her screen time was limited compared to Pitt's, Enos brought warmth, realism, and vulnerability to the role. Her believable chemistry with Pitt helped establish the stakes early in the film, because audiences genuinely believed they were watching a loving family suddenly thrown into unimaginable danger. James Badgedale portrayed Captain Speak, the military officer responsible for helping Gerry escape the initial outbreak aboard the naval vessel. Dale had already appeared in several respected productions, including The Pacific, The Departed, Iron Man 3, and Flight. Known for portraying disciplined military figures and determined professionals, he brought credibility and quiet authority to the role. Although Captain Speak does not dominate the story, his leadership during moments of chaos reinforces the film's emphasis on cooperation between military forces and civilians attempting to survive the pandemic. Dale's natural screen presence helped establish trust immediately, allowing audiences to believe his character without lengthy introductions. Matthew Fox appeared briefly as Parjumper, a mysterious military survivor. Although his role was surprisingly small, his casting generated considerable curiosity because Fox had become internationally famous through the television series Lost, where he played Dr. Jack Shepherd for 6 successful seasons. Many viewers expected his character to play a much larger role because early reports suggested he would become significant in later sections of the story. However, extensive rewrites and the redesigned ending greatly reduced his involvement. Despite appearing only briefly, Fox's casting reflected the production's ambition to assemble recognizable talent throughout even the smaller supporting roles. Daniela Kurdish portrayed Segan, an Israeli soldier who becomes Gerry's companion after surviving one of the film's most intense action sequences. At the time, Kurdish was relatively unknown outside her home country, making World War Z her biggest international breakthrough. Segan quickly became one of the movie's most memorable characters because she combined courage, discipline, and humanity under impossible circumstances. After losing her hand during a desperate escape, she continued fighting without surrendering to fear or despair. Kurdish delivered a physically demanding performance that required extensive action choreography while also conveying emotional resilience. Her role demonstrated that heroism in World War Z was not limited to its famous leading actor, but extended to ordinary people making extraordinary sacrifices. Fana Makona portrayed Chirio Matoni, Gerry's former colleague at the United Nations. Makona, an accomplished South African actor, brought dignity and intelligence to the role. Gerry serves as a catalyst for Gerry's journey, persuading him to leave the relative safety of his family in order to search for a solution to humanity's greatest crisis. Although the character appears only during certain portions of the story, his calm professionalism reflects the film's emphasis on international cooperation rather than individual heroics alone. Makona's performance reinforces the idea that leadership during catastrophe requires compassion as much as authority. Although World War Z belongs to the zombie genre, its cultural impact reached far beyond traditional horror audiences. Released in 2013, the film arrived during a period when zombies had become one of the most popular subjects in entertainment. Television audiences were captivated by The Walking Dead. Video games such as Left 4 Dead and DayZ had built enormous communities, and novels featuring post-apocalyptic survival stories were selling in record numbers. Instead of simply following the established formula of slow-moving undead creatures wandering through abandoned streets, World War Z introduced an entirely different interpretation of the zombie apocalypse. The infected moved with incredible speed, attacked in overwhelming numbers, and behaved almost like a coordinated natural disaster rather than individual monsters. This fresh approach immediately distinguished the film from many of its contemporaries and sparked countless discussions among horror fans about which style of zombie was more terrifying. One of the movie's greatest cultural contributions was the way it transformed the zombie outbreak into a true global crisis. Many earlier zombie films focused on a single town, shopping mall, farmhouse, or isolated community. World War Z expanded the scale dramatically, taking audiences across multiple continents, including North America, South Korea, Israel, Wales, and the open ocean. This international perspective made the catastrophe feel far more believable and emphasized how interconnected modern civilization had become. Air travel, global trade, and international diplomacy all played significant roles in both spreading the infection and attempting to stop it. Rather than presenting survival as a responsibility of one country alone, the film suggested that only worldwide cooperation could provide humanity with any chance of success. The visual imagery introduced by World War Z quickly became some of the most recognizable in modern horror cinema. Perhaps the most famous sequence shows thousands of infected individuals climbing over one another to scale the enormous defensive wall surrounding Jerusalem. The sight of human bodies forming a living pyramid remains one of the defining images of 21st century zombie filmmaking. It demonstrated how overwhelming sheer numbers could become when combined with relentless speed. The scene has been referenced in online discussions, fan artwork, reaction videos, and comparisons with other disaster films ever since its release. Even people who have never watched a complete movie often recognize this unforgettable moment. Another reason the film resonated with audiences was its portrayal of fear spreading faster than information. Throughout the story, governments struggle to understand what is happening while ordinary citizens rely on rumors, panic, and incomplete reports. Airports become dangerous, highways fill with abandoned vehicles, and cities descend into confusion within hours. This portrayal reflected real anxieties about how quickly modern societies could unravel when communication systems became overwhelmed. Viewers recognized that despite technological advances, civilization remained vulnerable when reliable information disappeared and fear began replacing rational decision-making. Years after the film's release, many viewers returned to World War Z during the global COVID-19 pandemic. Although the movie was never intended to predict real events, audiences noticed striking similarities between the fictional outbreak and certain aspects of the real-world health crisis. Scenes involving governments racing to understand an unknown disease, airports becoming point of concern, medical experts searching for treatments, and populations reacting with uncertainty suddenly felt much more realistic than they had in 2013. Social media was filled with comparisons between the movie and real events, leading many people to revisit the film with a completely different perspective. What had once seemed like exaggerated science fiction now appeared to contain surprisingly believable observations about human behavior during worldwide emergencies. The movie also contributed to changing expectations within the zombie genre itself. Traditional zombies had often been portrayed as slow, decaying creatures whose greatest threat came from overwhelming numbers over long periods of time. World War Z instead presented infected humans capable of sprinting at incredible speeds, reacting almost instantly to sound and moving with frightening coordination. This interpretation increased the intensity of action scenes and influenced audience expectations for future productions. While fast zombies had appeared in earlier works, such as 28 Days Later, World War Z introduced the concept to a much broader mainstream audience through its blockbuster scale and global marketing campaign. Beyond horror, the film explored themes that reflected growing concerns about globalization. Diseases no longer remained isolated within distant regions because international transportation allowed infections to spread across continents within hours. Governments depended on one another for intelligence, scientific research, and military assistance. The movie suggested that no nation could survive alone in an interconnected world. This message resonated with audiences living in an era increasingly defined by international cooperation, global supply chains, and worldwide communication networks. It reminded viewers that humanity's greatest challenges often ignore political borders. The infected themselves became symbolic of unstoppable natural forces rather than traditional movie villains. Unlike many zombie stories that emphasize individual monsters, World War Z portrayed infection as something resembling a tidal wave, earthquake, or hurricane. The massive swarms moved almost like flowing water, adapting instantly to obstacles and overwhelming every defensive position through relentless momentum. This presentation shifted the focus away from individual combat and toward large-scale disaster management. Behind the scenes, the production of World War Z became almost as dramatic as the story being told on screen. What eventually reached theaters as a polished global blockbuster was the result of years of development, creative disagreements, extensive rewrites, expensive reshoots, and countless production challenges. The journey from Max Brooks' best-selling novel to the finished film was anything but straightforward. In fact, many industry insiders believed the movie would become one of Hollywood's biggest failures long before it was released. Instead, it overcame enormous obstacles and eventually became one of the most successful zombie films ever made. The project began after Brad Pitt's production company, Plan B Entertainment, secured the rights to Max Brooks' novel. Brooks' book was unlike most zombie stories because it was written as a collection of interviews conducted after humanity had survived the zombie war. Rather than following one central hero, the novel presented dozens of individual accounts from soldiers, politicians, doctors, civilians, and survivors around the world. This structure worked brilliantly as literature, but created an enormous challenge for filmmakers. Hollywood generally prefers a central protagonist with a clear emotional journey, making the original format extremely difficult to adapt into a traditional feature film. Several writers worked on adapting the screenplay before production finally settled on a version that transformed the source material into a completely new narrative centered on Gerry Lane. While many fans of the novel were surprised by how different the film became, the filmmakers believed this approach was necessary to create a fast-paced cinematic experience. Instead of attempting to recreate every interview from a book, they borrowed its worldwide perspective and combined it with an original story designed specifically for the screen. Director Marc Forster was chosen to lead the production despite not being known primarily for large-scale action films. Before World War Z, Forster had directed movies such as Finding Neverland, Stranger Than Fiction, The Kite Runner, and the James Bond adventure Quantum of Solace. His background combined emotional storytelling with visual spectacle, making him an unusual but intriguing choice. Rather than treating the film purely as an action movie, Forster emphasized the emotional consequences of global disaster and focused heavily on the human cost of the outbreak. His direction constantly balanced intimate family moments with massive sequences involving thousands of infected people. Principal photography took place across several countries to create the impression of a truly worldwide pandemic. Although the story visits locations including Philadelphia, South Korea, Jerusalem, Wales, and various military facilities, filming often occurred somewhere entirely different. Glasgow, Scotland, became one of the production's most important locations. Entire sections of the Scottish city were transformed into Philadelphia during the chaotic opening act. American police cars, buses, storefronts, street signs, and vehicles were imported or recreated to convince audiences they were watching the United States. Local residents watched as familiar streets were filled with abandoned cars, crashed buses, emergency vehicles, and hundreds of extras portraying terrified civilians. Malta played an equally important role during production. Its historic architecture doubled for Jerusalem during one of the film's largest action sequences. Massive sections of defensive walls, military checkpoints, and crowded refugee camps were constructed to create the illusion of a fortified city under siege. Hundreds of extras participated in these scenes, many of which required precise coordination between actors, stunt performers, military vehicles, helicopters, and extensive visual effects. The famous sequence showing infected humans climbing over one another to breach Jerusalem's walls combined practical performers with sophisticated computer-generated imagery to create one of the film's most unforgettable moments. The production relied heavily on practical effects whenever possible. Thousands of extras were employed throughout filming to portray panicked civilians, soldiers, refugees, and infected victims. Makeup artists spent countless hours applying wounds, pale skin tones, blood effects, and prosthetics before filming each day. Unlike earlier zombie movies that emphasized rotting flesh, the infected in World War Z retained a more recently infected appearance. The filmmakers wanted audiences to recognize that these people had transformed only moments earlier, making their condition feel more immediate and disturbing. Of course, practical effects alone could never achieve the enormous scale envisioned by the filmmakers. Visual effects companies created digital crowds numbering in the tens of thousands. Advanced crowd simulation software allowed individual infected characters to move independently while behaving like part of a massive swarm. Animators studied the movement of insects, schools of fish, and packs of wild animals to create the unnatural yet strangely believable motion seen throughout the film. Instead of shambling slowly, the infected exploded into frantic bursts of speed, colliding with one another as they relentlessly pursued healthy humans. Perhaps the most famous behind-the-scenes story concerns the movie's ending. After early test screenings, the filmmakers realized the original third act was not delivering the emotional impact they wanted. The initial finale featured a massive battle involving large-scale military action and extensive destruction. Although visually spectacular, many involved felt it lacked suspense and shifted too far toward conventional action rather than intelligent survival. Rather than releasing a version they considered disappointing, the studio made the remarkable decision to replace much of the final act entirely. This decision resulted in one of the most expensive reshoot operations in recent Hollywood history. Screenwriter Damon Lindelof was brought in to help rethink the conclusion, while Drew Goddard later refined sections of the rewritten material. The new ending abandoned the large battle and instead focused on Gerry infiltrating a World Health Organization laboratory in Wales. World War Z tells its story through the eyes of one man caught in the middle of a worldwide catastrophe. But unlike many zombie films that focus on isolated survival, its narrative continually expands to reveal the global scale of humanity's collapse. The film combines elements of horror, action, mystery, and disaster cinema into a fast-moving thriller that constantly raises the stakes. Rather than presenting the outbreak as a slow-burning apocalypse, the story throws audiences directly into chaos within the opening minutes, creating a relentless pace that rarely allows either the characters or the viewers an opportunity to breathe. The narrative begins by introducing Gerry Lane, a former United Nations investigator who has left his dangerous career behind to spend more time with his wife Karen and their 2 young daughters. This peaceful family life is established only briefly before the film abruptly shifts into crisis. While driving through the streets of Philadelphia, Gerry notices unusual disturbances. Traffic suddenly comes to a standstill. Police vehicles race toward unknown emergencies. Helicopters fly overhead, and frightened crowds begin running in every direction. Within moments, what appears to be an ordinary traffic accident transforms in complete panic as infected individuals begin attacking everyone around them. This sudden transition from normal life to absolute chaos immediately establishes the film's central theme. Civilization is far more fragile than people believe. The opening sequence serves as both an introduction to the outbreak and an effective demonstration of Gerry's skills. Unlike traditional action heroes who rely primarily on violence, Gerry survives by remaining calm under enormous pressure. He carefully observes his surroundings, quickly identifies patterns, and makes rapid decisions that save his family multiple times. His ability to stay focused while others panic immediately distinguishes him from people around him. This characterization becomes essential because the film is not about defeating zombies through strength alone, but about understanding an unknown threat through intelligence and observation. After escaping Philadelphia, Gerry and his family eventually reach a United States Navy vessel serving as a temporary command center for surviving government officials and military personnel. Here, the narrative introduces its first major turning point. Gerry learns that the outbreak has spread across multiple continents, and that governments everywhere are struggling to understand what has caused the infection. Because of his previous experience as a United Nations investigator, Gerry is asked to travel around the world in search of information that could lead to a solution. Although reluctant to leave his family behind, he realizes refusing the mission would place them at even greater risk. This decision launches the film's central journey and transforms the story from one family's survival into humanity's desperate search for hope. From this point forward, the narrative adopts an episodic structure, with each location providing another piece of the larger mystery. Gerry first travels to South Korea, where military officials believe they may have discovered important clues about the earliest stages of the outbreak. Instead of simply delivering action sequences, each destination functions almost like a detective investigation. Gerry interviews survivors, examines evidence, and gradually begins identifying behavioral patterns among the infected. This investigative approach separates World War Z from many zombie movies by emphasizing problem-solving rather than constant combat. The South Korea sequence also introduces one of the film's most important narrative techniques. Every encounter provides information that becomes valuable later. Gerry learns that the infected are attracted by sound, react almost instantly to movement, and spread the infection within seconds through bites. The discovery that the outbreak escalated with astonishing speed reinforces the overwhelming nature of the crisis, while also encouraging audiences to pay close attention to seemingly minor details. Throughout the story, observations that initially appear insignificant later become critical to understanding the infected. The next major turning point occurs in Jerusalem, one of the few cities that has successfully protected itself by constructing enormous defensive walls before the global collapse. Initially, the city appears to represent hope. Survivors from different backgrounds have gathered behind secure defenses, suggesting that cooperation rather than conflict offers humanity its best chance of survival. For a brief moment, the audience experiences a sense of optimism that civilization may still endure despite the worldwide disaster. However, this optimism is deliberately short-lived. The famous Jerusalem sequence becomes one of the film's most dramatic reversals. The celebration of safety generates loud singing that attracts enormous swarms of infected outside the walls. The zombies begin climbing over one another, forming a living pyramid that eventually breaches the city's defenses. This scene functions as both an action spectacle and a symbolic reminder that even humanity's greatest achievements remain vulnerable when people underestimate the threat they face. The collapse of Jerusalem represents the destruction of false security and forces Gerry back into a desperate struggle for survival. During the escape from Jerusalem, another significant narrative development occurs when Gerry meets Segan, an Israeli soldier who becomes his traveling companion after surviving a traumatic attack that results in the loss of her hand. Their partnership adds emotional depth without distracting from the central mission. Segan's resilience reflects a broader theme that survival depends not only on physical endurance, but also on emotional determination. Her presence also provides Gerry with someone who shares the burden of witnessing humanity's collapse firsthand. The narrative continues building toward its climax when Gerry's plane crashes after an infected passenger transforms during the flight. The crash sequence dramatically narrows the scale of the story. After witnessing global destruction involving entire cities and nations, Gerry suddenly finds himself nearly alone in unfamiliar territory. This shift from worldwide spectacle to intimate survival creates a welcome change of pace while maintaining the overall tension. Beneath its thrilling action sequences and terrifying zombie attacks, World War Z explores a surprisingly rich collection of themes that elevate it far beyond a conventional horror film. While audiences are immediately drawn to the spectacle of collapsing cities and relentless infected hordes, the movie constantly asks deeper questions about humanity, survival, leadership, sacrifice, and the fragile nature of civilization. Every major event serves not only to advance the plot, but also to reinforce ideas about how people respond when confronted with unimaginable fear. Instead of focusing solely on monsters, the film ultimately becomes a story about human behavior during the greatest crisis in history. Perhaps the film's most significant theme is survival, through intelligence rather than brute strength. Throughout the story, Gerry Lane rarely wins because he is physically stronger than his opponents. In fact, he spends much of the film running away rather than fighting. His greatest weapon is his ability to observe details, remain calm under pressure, and recognize patterns that others overlook. While soldiers rely on weapons and governments rely on military force, Gerry relies on curiosity and critical thinking. This theme becomes increasingly important as the narrative progresses because every major breakthrough results from careful observation rather than violent confrontation. The film suggests that humanity's greatest advantage has never been physical power, but the ability to learn, adapt, and solve problems. Closely connected to this idea is the theme of adaptation. Nature constantly rewards species capable of adjusting to changing environments, and World War Z presents humanity facing exactly that challenge. The infected evolve into an unstoppable force that spreads faster than traditional methods of defense can handle. Every successful character survives because they adapt quickly to new information instead of clinging to old assumptions. Gerry changes his strategies repeatedly as he discovers new facts about the infected, while those who hesitate or refuse to accept reality often become victims. The film reminds viewers that survival often depends on flexibility rather than stubbornness. Another central theme is the importance of family as a source of purpose. Gerry's journey begins not because he wants to become a hero, but because he wants to protect his wife Karen and their 2 daughters. His family remains his emotional anchor throughout the film, giving every dangerous decision personal meaning. Even when separated by thousands of miles, Gerry's thoughts continually return to them. Unlike many action heroes driven by revenge or ambition, Gerry acts out of love and responsibility. This emotional foundation allows audiences to connect with a global catastrophe on an intimate level, because the fate of the world is constantly reflected through the experiences of one ordinary family trying to remain together. The movie also examines the idea of sacrifice. Nearly every major character gives up something important for the benefit of others. Soldiers sacrifice their safety protecting civilians. Medical researchers continue working despite overwhelming danger. Pilots risk their lives transporting survivors across infected territories. Gerry repeatedly accepts missions that could easily result in his death because he believes the possibility of saving millions outweighs his own survival. These sacrifices reinforce the film's belief that civilization depends upon individuals willing to place the needs of others above their own comfort and security. Leadership forms another powerful theme running throughout the narrative. The film presents several different styles of leadership, allowing audiences to compare their effectiveness during crisis. Gerry demonstrates calm, analytical leadership based on observation and cooperation. Military officers provide discipline and organization under impossible circumstances. Medical professionals contribute scientific knowledge rather than physical force. Political leaders attempt to coordinate international responses despite limited information. World War Z argues that successful leadership during disaster requires humility, communication, and the willingness to make difficult decisions without complete certainty. Hope remains one of the film's most important emotional themes. Despite depicting humanity at the edge of extinction, the movie consistently refuses to surrender to complete despair. Every new location offers another opportunity to discover valuable information. Even devastating failures contribute to Gerry's understanding of the infected. The narrative suggests that hope is not blind optimism, but the determination to continue searching for solutions regardless of overwhelming odds. This perspective separates World War Z from many darker post-apocalyptic stories, where survival becomes meaningless. Here, hope itself becomes an essential survival tool. The infected can also be understood as symbols rather than simply monsters. They represent the unstoppable force of global catastrophe, whether interpreted as disease, war, environmental disaster, or societal collapse. Their overwhelming numbers emphasize how quickly established systems can fail when confronted with challenges beyond normal experience. Unlike villains motivated by hatred or ambition, the infected possess no personalities or individual identities. They function as a natural disaster given human form, reminding audiences that some threats cannot be negotiated with or reasoned against. This symbolic interpretation shifts attention away from the monsters themselves and toward humanity's collective response. One of the film's strongest symbolic images appears during the assault on Jerusalem. The enormous protective wall represents humanity's desire for security and control. Built to keep danger outside, it becomes a physical symbol of civilization's confidence in its own defenses. Yet the infected eventually overcome this barrier by literally climbing over one another. The image suggests that no wall, regardless of its size, can provide permanent protection if people fail to understand the true nature of the threat. The collapse of the wall symbolizes the destruction of false confidence and reminds viewers that preparedness requires more than physical barriers. Sound functions as another recurring symbol throughout the story. One of the defining characteristics of World War Z is its distinctive visual style, which blends the scale of a global disaster film with the intensity of survival thriller. Rather than adopting the dark, decaying aesthetic commonly associated with zombie movies, the filmmakers chose a cleaner, more realistic visual approach that emphasizes speed, chaos, and overwhelming scale. Every creative decision, from the camera work and lighting to the color palette and visual effects, was designed to make audiences feel as though they were witnessing a real worldwide catastrophe unfolding in real time. The result is a film that feels grounded despite its extraordinary premise, allowing viewers to become immersed in the story rather than distracted by excessive stylistic flourishes. Director Marc Forster approached the film with the intention of creating a sense of constant movement. The camera rarely remains still for long, particularly during the major outbreak sequences. Instead, it follows characters closely through crowded streets, narrow hallways, military compounds, and collapsing environments. This kinetic style creates an almost documentary-like immediacy, making viewers feel as though they are running alongside Gerry Lane rather than simply observing events from a comfortable distance. The frequent use of handheld camera work during moments of panic reinforces this feeling, introducing slight instability that mirrors the uncertainty experienced by the characters. The opening sequence in Philadelphia immediately establishes the film's visual philosophy. It begins with ordinary, familiar images of city life before rapidly descending into complete disorder. Wide shots capture crowded highways and towering buildings, while close-up shots focus on frightened faces, abandoned vehicles, and desperate attempts to escape. This combination of large-scale spectacle and intimate human perspective becomes one of the film's defining visual techniques. Instead of presenting destruction purely for entertainment, the camera continually reminds audiences that every collapsing street and overturned vehicle represents ordinary lives being torn apart. Framing plays an important role throughout the narrative. Gerry Lane is often positioned at the center of crowded compositions, surrounded by confusion, yet remaining visually isolated from the chaos around him. Even in scenes involving thousands of people, careful framing ensures that viewers never lose sight of his perspective. This technique strengthens the emotional connection between the audience and the protagonist, while emphasizing his role as the viewer's guide through an increasingly incomprehensible world. At the same time, wide establishing shots frequently remind audiences that Gerry is only one individual confronting a disaster far larger than himself. The film's color palette contributes significantly to its realistic atmosphere. Unlike many horror films that rely heavily on deep shadows or exaggerated color grading, World War Z favors naturalistic tones. Urban environments are dominated by cool grays, muted blues, and concrete textures that reflect modern cities rather than stylized fictional settings. Military ships feature metallic surfaces and subdued colors that reinforce professionalism and order, while outdoor locations maintain realistic lighting conditions instead of dramatic cinematic exaggeration. This restrained palette allows the sudden appearance of blood, fire, explosions, and emergency lights to become even more visually striking. Lighting is used carefully to reflect changes in mood throughout the story. Early scenes are brightly lit with natural daylight, emphasizing how suddenly ordinary life disappears when the outbreak begins. As Gerry travels across the globe, lighting gradually becomes more varied depending on location. South Korea features dim military installations illuminated by artificial lighting and flashlights, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and hidden danger. Jerusalem is presented with bright sunlight that initially suggests hope and stability before descending into violent chaos. Finally, the World Health Organization facility in Wales adopts cold, sterile lighting that reflects science, precision, and clinical observation rather than emotional intensity. Each environment possesses its own visual identity while remaining consistent with the film's grounded style. Perhaps the most remarkable visual achievement in World War Z is its portrayal of the infected, Rather than depicting slow-moving, undead creatures with exaggerated makeup, the filmmakers envisioned infected humans driven entirely by uncontrollable biological instinct. Their movement became one of the movie's defining characteristics. The infected sprint with incredible speed, leap over obstacles, and collide violently with one another as they pursue healthy victims. Their motion appears almost unnatural without becoming supernatural, creating a disturbing impression that these individuals have become living weapons rather than traditional movie monsters. The visual effects team invested enormous effort into creating realistic digital crowds capable of behaving like a single organism. Instead of animating identical figures repeatedly, advanced crowd simulation software generated thousands of individual infected characters, each reacting independently while contributing to the movement of the larger swarm. This approach allowed the infected to resemble waves crashing against barriers rather than isolated attackers. The famous Jerusalem sequence perfectly demonstrates this concept as thousands of bodies climb over one another to scale the city's defensive walls. The resulting image resembles an unstoppable tidal wave made entirely of human beings, becoming one of the most unforgettable visual moments in modern horror cinema. The soundtrack and sound design of World War Z play a vital role in shaping the film's atmosphere, often working quietly beneath the surface to create tension long before the audience consciously realizes it. While the movie is remembered for its large-scale action sequences and terrifying infected swarms, much of its emotional power comes from carefully crafted audio that enhances every moment of suspense, fear, hope, and uncertainty. Rather than relying solely on loud orchestral music or constant action cues, the filmmakers use silence, environmental sounds, and subtle musical themes to immerse viewers in a world where danger can appear without warning. The film's musical score was composed by Marco Beltrami, one of Hollywood's most respected composers. Before working on World War Z, Beltrami had already built an impressive career creating music for films such as Scream, I, Robot, The Hurt Locker, 3:10 to Yuma, Snowpiercer, and numerous other thrillers and action movies. His experience with suspenseful storytelling made him an ideal choice for a film that needed to balance emotional family drama with large-scale disaster spectacle. Instead of composing a traditional heroic score filled with triumphant melodies, Beltrami created music that reflected uncertainty, urgency, and constant psychological pressure. One of the defining qualities of the score is its restraint. Many modern action films use music almost continuously, filling every scene with powerful orchestral arrangements designed to generate excitement. World War Z frequently takes the opposite approach. Beltrami allows many sequences to unfold with minimal musical accompaniment, giving greater importance to natural sounds such as footsteps, distant screams, helicopter blades, breathing, and the sudden cries of the infected. This decision makes the moments when music finally enters feel significantly more powerful because the audience has already become immersed in the realistic soundscape. The opening act provides an excellent example of this philosophy. As Gerry Lane and his family drive through Philadelphia, the soundtrack initially remains calm and understated. Ordinary city sounds dominate the audio environment. Passing vehicles, conversations, traffic signals, and everyday urban life establish a sense of normality. As strange events begin unfolding, subtle musical tension gradually increases without immediately announcing that catastrophe has arrived. Instead of overwhelming viewers with dramatic orchestral music, the film allows confusion itself to become frightening. The audience hears distant sirens, helicopters, crashing vehicles, frightened crowds, and emergency broadcasts before fully understanding what is happening. This gradual layering of sound creates suspense naturally rather than forcing emotional reactions. As the outbreak accelerates, Beltrami introduces deeper percussion, low string arrangements, and unsettling rhythmic patterns that mirror the growing panic. Rather than emphasizing individual melodies, much of the score focuses on texture and atmosphere. The music often feels restless, never allowing viewers to become comfortable. This approach perfectly complements Gerry's journey because the audience experiences the same constant uncertainty as the characters. There is never a prolonged sense of safety, and the score reinforces this emotional instability throughout the film. One of the most remarkable achievements of the sound design is the creation of the infected themselves. Their vocalizations differ significantly from the slow, groaning zombies commonly associated with the genre. Instead of moaning aimlessly, the infected emit explosive screams, violent growls, frantic breathing, and sudden bursts of animal-like aggression. These sounds communicate speed, unpredictability, and uncontrollable instinct. Every attack begins almost instantly after a victim is detected, meaning the audio often serves as the first warning that danger has arrived. A sudden scream echoing through an empty street immediately raises tension because audiences understand how rapidly the infected can cover great distances. The movement of the infected also received extraordinary attention during post-production. Their footsteps are intentionally aggressive, producing the impression of overwhelming momentum rather than individual movement. When thousands of infected begin running simultaneously, the combined sound resembles an approaching avalanche or crashing ocean waves more than a group of human beings. This reinforces one of the film's central ideas. The infected behave less like individual monsters and more like a force of nature. Their collective sound becomes just as terrifying as their visual appearance. The famous Jerusalem sequence demonstrates the extraordinary coordination between music and sound effects. Before the infected breach the city's walls, singing fills the air as survivors celebrate their apparent safety. This joyful human sound gradually transforms into the very element that attracts the infected. The filmmakers deliberately allow the singing to dominate the soundtrack before introducing distant screams and the growing roar of the approaching swarm. As thousands of infected begin climbing over one another, music, crowd noise, military gunfire, collapsing structures, and human panic blend into an overwhelming wall of sound. Despite the enormous scale of the sequence, individual audio elements remain clear enough for audiences to follow the unfolding disaster without becoming overwhelmed by noise alone. When World War Z premiered in the summer of 2013, expectations were unusually complicated. Long before audiences entered theaters, the film had developed a reputation as one of Hollywood's most troubled productions. Reports of extensive rewrites, expensive reshoots, creative disagreements, and a rapidly increasing budget had dominated entertainment news for months. Many industry observers predicted that the movie would become a major commercial failure, and another example of a blockbuster collapsing under its own ambition. Instead, the finished film surprised both critics and audiences, overcoming its difficult production history to become one of the year's biggest successes and one of the most commercially successful zombie films ever made. Critical reception upon release was generally positive, although opinions vary regarding how closely the movie adapted Max Brooks' best-selling novel. Many reviewers praised the film for delivering intense suspense, impressive visual spectacle, and a refreshing global perspective that distinguished it from more traditional zombie stories. Critics frequently highlighted the movie's ability to maintain tension while avoiding excessive reliance on graphic violence. Rather than focusing on gore, the film emphasized large-scale disaster, intelligent problem-solving, and psychological suspense. This broader approach allowed it to appeal to viewers who might not normally watch horror films, significantly expanding its audience. One of the most consistently praised aspects of the film was Brad Pitt's performance. Critics appreciated that Gerry Lane was portrayed as an intelligent and resourceful investigator rather than a conventional action hero. Pitt's calm, understated approach gave the character credibility, allowing audiences to believe that careful observation and quick thinking could become humanity's greatest weapons during an unprecedented crisis. His performance also provided emotional stability throughout a story that continually shifted between countries and increasingly dangerous situations. Many reviewers noted that Pitt's presence helped ground the spectacle in believable human emotion, preventing the film from becoming an empty visual exercise. The scale of the production also received considerable praise. Reviewers admired the film's international scope, pointing out that few zombie movies had attempted to portray a truly global pandemic. Instead of remaining confined to a single city or isolated group of survivors, World War Z showed governments, military, scientists, and civilians across multiple continents responding simultaneously to the same catastrophe. This worldwide perspective gave the story a unique identity within the genre and helped distinguish it from countless other post-apocalyptic narratives. Critics often describe the film as feeling closer to a disaster movie than a traditional horror picture, a comparison that many considered one of its greatest strengths. The visual effects attracted significant attention as well. The enormous digital crowds of infected, particularly during the famous Jerusalem sequence, impressed both critics and audiences. The image of thousands of infected climbing over one another to scale the city's massive defensive walls quickly became one of the film's defining moments. Reviewers praise a seamless combination of practical filmmaking and computer-generated imagery, noting that the infected move with frightening speed and collective purpose unlike anything previously seen in mainstream zombie cinema. Many considered these visual innovations among the movie's greatest technical achievements. Marco Beltrami's musical score and the film's restrained sound design also received positive recognition. Rather than overwhelming viewers with constant orchestral action music, the soundtrack emphasized suspense, atmosphere, and emotional tension. Critics appreciated how silence and environmental sounds often became just as important as the musical score itself. This subtle approach enhanced the realism of the story and contributed significantly to the film's immersive quality. Despite its many strengths, World War Z was not without criticism. One of the most common complaints concerned its departure from Max Brooks' original novel. Fans of the book pointed out that the film abandoned the interview-based narrative structure that had made the source material so distinctive. Instead of presenting multiple perspectives from survivors around the world, the movie focused almost entirely on Gerry Lane's journey. While many viewers accepted this change as necessary for cinematic storytelling, others felt the adaptation sacrificed much of the novel's political depth and social commentary. For readers who had hoped for a faithful adaptation, the differences proved disappointing. Some reviewers also questioned the pacing of the final act. While many praised the suspenseful laboratory sequence for emphasizing intelligence over explosive action, others believed the transition from worldwide disaster to a quieter conclusion felt abrupt. Because much of the original ending had been replaced during reshoots, some critics sense a noticeable shift in tone during the closing chapters. Nevertheless, many acknowledge that the revised ending ultimately provided a more satisfying emotional resolution than a conventional action climax would likely have delivered. The legacy of World War Z extends far beyond its impressive box office success. While many blockbuster films enjoy a brief period of popularity before gradually fading from public memory, World War Z has remained one of the most frequently discussed zombie movies of the modern era. Its influence can be seen not only in later films, but also in television and video games, discussions about global pandemics, and the evolution of large-scale disaster storytelling. More than a decade after its release, the film continues to attract new audiences, while remaining a popular subject among longtime fans of the horror and action genres. Perhaps the film's greatest legacy is the way it redefined what a zombie blockbuster could be. Before World War Z, zombie movies were often viewed primarily as horror films with relatively modest budgets, limited locations, and small groups of survivors. While there had certainly been successful exceptions, most zombie stories remained intimate tales focused on isolated communities struggling against overwhelming odds. World War Z demonstrated that the genre could successfully support the scale of a major international blockbuster. By combining horror, action, mystery, and disaster filmmaking, it expanded audience expectations and proved that zombie stories could compete with the biggest productions in Hollywood. The movie also helped popularize the concept of zombies as a global phenomenon rather than a localized disaster. Earlier classics often explored the collapse of individual towns, neighborhoods, shopping malls, or isolated regions. World War Z instead presented the outbreak as a crisis affecting every continent almost simultaneously. Governments, militaries, scientists, and civilians all became part of the same worldwide struggle. This broader perspective influenced later productions by encouraging filmmakers to think beyond individual survival stories and consider how entire nations might respond to catastrophic events. One of the film's most enduring contributions is its visual portrayal of infected swarms. The image of thousands of infected individuals climbing over one another to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles immediately became iconic. The Jerusalem sequence remains one of the most recognizable scenes in modern horror cinema and has been referenced countless times in discussions about visual effects, crowd simulation, and blockbuster filmmaking. The infected no longer behaved like slow-moving monsters, but instead resembled a living force of nature. Their movement inspired comparisons with insect colonies, flooding rivers in massive waves, creating a style of visual horror that felt entirely different from traditional zombie films. This innovative approach influenced numerous later productions featuring infected creatures, monsters, or rapidly spreading threats. Even films that did not directly imitate World War Z often borrowed elements of its emphasis on speed, overwhelming numbers, and coordinated movement. The concept of creatures functioning almost like a single organism became increasingly common in both cinema and video games after the film's release. Developers recognized that relentless momentum could generate fear just as effectively as individual monsters. The influence of World War Z can also be seen within the gaming industry. Although zombie games had already become extremely popular before 2013, the movie reinforced interest in large-scale outbreaks involving enormous crowds of infected enemies. Several games emphasized massive swarms rather than isolated encounters, encouraging players to think strategically rather than relying solely on combat. The eventual release of the cooperative video game titled World War Z further expanded the franchise's influence. Rather than adapting the film scene by scene, the game embraced its central concept of overwhelming infected hordes while allowing players to experience similar large-scale battles across multiple international locations. Its success demonstrated that audiences remained fascinated by the film's interpretation of the zombie apocalypse years after theatrical debut. The movie's emphasis on investigation rather than constant action also left a lasting impression. Gerry Lane succeeds because he studies the infected, recognizes behavioral patterns, and applies scientific reasoning instead of relying purely on military strength. This approach influenced later stories involving pandemics and biological threats by showing that intelligence could be just as exciting as combat, rather than portraying scientists as secondary characters. World War Z placed research and observation at the center of humanity's survival. This balance between action and intellectual problem-solving became one of the film's defining characteristics. Another important aspect of the film's legacy emerged years after its release during the COVID-19 pandemic. As real-world societies faced lockdowns, travel restrictions, overwhelmed healthcare systems, and rapidly spreading disease, many viewers returned to World War Z with renewed interest. Although the movie depicted a fictional zombie outbreak rather than a realistic virus, audiences noticed numerous similarities in portrayal of global coordination, scientific urgency, emergency responses, and public uncertainty. Discussions across social media frequently compared scenes from the film with real-world events, leading many people to appreciate its depiction of international crisis management in a completely new light. One of the reasons World War Z continues to resonate with audiences years after its release is that viewers connected with it on multiple emotional levels. While many people initially expected another action-packed zombie film, they instead found a story that explored fear, hope, responsibility, and the resilience of ordinary people during extraordinary circumstances. Different generations interpreted the movie in different ways, but almost everyone found something familiar within its depiction of a world suddenly transformed by an unimaginable crisis. The film encouraged audiences to think not only about survival, but also about how individuals, families, communities, and entire nations respond when everything they depend on begins to collapse. For many viewers, the strongest emotional connection came through Gerry Lane's relationship with his family. Instead of introducing a hero motivated by revenge or personal glory, the film presented a father whose greatest concern was protecting his wife and daughters. This simple motivation immediately made the story more relatable. Parents identified with Gerry's willingness to risk everything for his children, while younger viewers recognized the comfort and security that families try to provide during frightening situations. The emotional foundation of the movie remained grounded in love rather than violence, allowing audiences to care deeply about the characters even as the story expanded into a worldwide disaster. Many viewers also appreciated that Gerry succeeded because of intelligence instead of physical strength. In countless action films, heroes survive by defeating enemies through superior combat skills or overwhelming firepower. Gerry's greatest strengths were observation, patience, calm decision-making, and the ability to recognize patterns that others missed. Audiences responded positively to this approach because it suggested that ordinary people could contribute meaningfully during a crisis through knowledge and clear thinking rather than extraordinary physical abilities. This made the character feel more realistic and accessible than many traditional blockbuster protagonists. The film also sparked discussions about how people believed they would behave during a real global emergency. Viewers frequently asked themselves difficult questions while watching the movie. Would they protect strangers or focus only on their own families? Would they remain calm or panic? Would they trust governments, scientists, or military leaders? These questions extended beyond the fictional zombie outbreak and encouraged audiences to reflect on their own values and decision-making under pressure. The movie became less about monsters and more about human character when tested by impossible circumstances. For younger audiences who grew up during an era of increasing global connectivity, World War Z reflected a world where events occurring in one country could rapidly affect every other nation. The film demonstrated how quickly international travel could spread both opportunity and disaster. Younger viewers, already accustomed to constant communication through the internet and social media, found the movie's worldwide perspective particularly believable. Rather than portraying isolated communities, the story emphasized humanity's interconnected nature, reinforcing the idea that global problems require global solutions. Older audiences often interpreted the film differently. Many recognized parallels with historical moments involving political uncertainty, disease outbreaks, terrorism, economic instability, or natural disasters. They appreciated that the movie focused on leadership, preparation, and cooperation rather than simply delivering nonstop action. Gerry's experience as a former United Nations investigator appealed to viewers who value diplomacy and international collaboration, suggesting that knowledge and communication remain essential even during the most extreme emergencies. The film's emphasis on scientific discovery also resonated strongly with audiences. Instead of introducing a miraculous cure or an unbeatable weapon, the story presented progress as a result of careful observation, research, and experimentation. Many viewers appreciated that humanity's greatest breakthrough emerged from understanding the infected rather than destroying them. This realistic approach reinforced respect for science, medicine, and critical thinking. Audiences found satisfaction in watching intelligence triumph over fear because the solution felt earned rather than artificially convenient. One of the most discussed aspects of audience interpretation involves the infected themselves. Some viewers saw them simply as terrifying monsters, while others interpret them as symbols representing uncontrollable global crises. Depending on personal experiences, the infected came to represent pandemics, war, climate disasters, terrorism, economic collapse, or even the rapid spread of misinformation. Because the film never limited the outbreak to a single symbolic meaning, audiences were free to project their own fears onto the story. This flexibility helped explain why the movie remained relevant long after its original release. When the COVID-19 pandemic began years later, audience interpretations changed dramatically. Viewers returned to World War Z often found scenes that suddenly felt much more realistic than they had in 2013. Government attempting to understand an unfamiliar disease, overwhelmed transportation systems, scientific research racing against time, uncertainty surrounding public safety, and international cooperation all mirror experiences people were witnessing in real life. Although the film's fictional virus transformed people into violent infected creatures, its depiction of society's initial confusion felt surprisingly familiar. Many audiences described rewatching the movie as an entirely different experience because their understanding of global emergencies had fundamentally changed. One of the greatest strengths of World War Z is that its characters feel like ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances rather than exaggerated action heroes. While the film is remembered for its global scale and relentless pace, the emotional foundation of the story comes from the personal journeys of its central characters. Instead of focusing on dramatic personality changes, the movie presents quieter, more realistic forms of development that emerge through experience, responsibility, sacrifice, and survival. Each major character contributes to the story by representing different aspects of humanity's response to an unprecedented global disaster. At the center of the narrative is Gerry Lane, portrayed by Brad Pitt. At the beginning of the film, Gerry is no longer the adventurous United Nations investigator he once was. He has deliberately stepped away from his dangerous career in order to spend more time with his wife Karen and their 2 daughters. His priority is no longer solving international conflicts, but enjoying the ordinary routines of family life. This decision immediately establishes Gerry as someone who has already experienced enough danger and now seeks peace. His character begins the story as a devoted husband and father rather than an ambitious professional, making his eventual return to the field feel both reluctant and deeply personal. The outbreak forces Gerry to rediscover abilities he had hoped never to use again. During the opening scenes in Philadelphia, audiences witness his remarkable capacity to remain calm while everyone around him descends into panic. Rather than freezing with fear, he instinctively observes his surroundings, notices patterns, and makes rapid decisions that repeatedly save his family. These early moments reveal that Gerry's investigative instincts have never disappeared. They have merely been dormant beneath his desire for a quieter life. As the story progresses, Gerry's greatest internal conflict becomes balancing his responsibility to his family with his responsibility to humanity. Every decision he makes carries enormous personal consequences. Accepting the mission to investigate the outbreak means leaving his wife and daughters behind, possibly forever. Refusing the mission could place them in even greater danger because their safety depends on the military's protection. Gerry ultimately chooses to continue the mission not because he seeks recognition or heroism, but because he believes finding answers offers the best chance of protecting his loved ones. This choice transforms him from a man focused solely on his family into someone willing to risk everything for the survival of millions. One of Gerry's defining characteristics is his willingness to learn. Unlike many action protagonists who enter dangerous situations believing they already possess every necessary skill, Gerry constantly adapts his thinking as new information becomes available. He listens carefully to scientists, soldiers, civilians, and survivors. Every encounter teaches him something about the infected, and he never allows pride to prevent him from changing his assumptions. This intellectual flexibility becomes the foundation of his entire character arc. By the film's conclusion, Gerry has evolved from someone reacting to disaster into someone capable of understanding it, ultimately discovering humanity's first meaningful defense against infection. Gerry Lane, played by Mireille Enos, experiences a quieter but equally meaningful journey. At first glance, she appears to fit the familiar role of the supportive spouse, remaining behind while the hero embarks on a dangerous mission. However, Karen proves far more resilient than the stereotype suggests. During the outbreak, she remains composed while caring for her daughters under unimaginable circumstances. Rather than collapsing emotionally, she becomes a stabilizing force within her family whenever Gerry is absent. Her greatest challenge is accepting that she cannot accompany her husband or control his fate. Instead, she demonstrates courage through patience, trust, and unwavering emotional support. Karen's relationship with Gerry also develops throughout the film. Their conversations become increasingly meaningful because every phone call could potentially be their last. Despite the physical distance separating them, their emotional bond remains remarkably strong. Karen never attempts to persuade Gerry to abandon his mission for personal reasons because she understands that his work may save countless families beyond their own. This mutual respect strengthens their relationship and reinforces one of the film's central themes. Genuine love often requires personal sacrifice rather than possessiveness. Segan, portrayed by Daniela Curtis, undergoes one of the most visible transformations in the story. Introduced as a disciplined Israeli soldier during the Jerusalem sequence, she initially appears confident and highly trained. However, the sudden attack on the city changes her life forever. After losing her hand while escaping the infected, Segan faces both severe physical injury and overwhelming emotional trauma. In many films, such an injury would immediately remove a character from a narrative. Instead, Segan refuses to surrender to despair. Her resilience becomes one of the movie's most inspiring examples of personal strength. Despite suffering tremendous pain, she continues assisting Gerry throughout the remainder of the mission. She adapts quickly to her disability, demonstrating that courage is measured not by physical perfection, but by determination. Segan never allows her injury to define her identity. Instead, she represents humanity's remarkable ability to endure devastating loss while continuing to fight for a greater purpose. Her partnership with Gerry also develops naturally through shared experience rather than forced emotional drama. They come to trust one another because survival depends upon cooperation and mutual respect. Although World War Z is remembered primarily for its large-scale action sequences and terrifying infected hordes, its costume, makeup, and production design play an equally important role in creating the film's believable atmosphere. Rather than embracing the exaggerated visual style often associated with zombie movies, the filmmakers chose a grounded, realistic approach that makes the worldwide catastrophe feel authentic. Every costume, set, and makeup decision supports the central goal of convincing audiences that this extraordinary disaster is unfolding within the recognizable modern world. The result is a visual environment where realism enhances suspense, allowing viewers to imagine that the events on screen could happen in places that look remarkably similar to their own everyday surroundings. One of the most effective aspects of the costume design is its emphasis on practicality. Gerry Lane spends nearly the entire film wearing ordinary civilian clothing rather than a stylized action hero outfit. At the beginning of the story, he appears in casual shirts, jackets, jeans, and practical footwear that immediately establish him as an ordinary family man rather than professional soldier. His wardrobe reflects someone who expected to spend the day with his wife and daughters instead of traveling across multiple continents during the collapse of civilization. This simple costume choice strengthens the audience's connection to Gerry because he looks like someone who could easily exist in the real world. As the story progresses, Gerry's clothing gradually changes to reflect the physical and emotional journey he experiences. Dirt, sweat, blood, torn fabric, and signs of exhaustion accumulate naturally throughout the film. Unlike many action movies where characters somehow remain perfectly dressed despite constant danger, World War Z allows Gerry's appearance to evolve realistically. His clothing becomes a visual record of his experiences, silently communicating the hardships he has endured without requiring additional dialogue. Every stain and tear reminds viewers of the increasingly impossible circumstances he continues to survive. Karen Lane's costumes also reinforce her role within the story. She wears comfortable, everyday clothing appropriate for a mother caring for two young children. Nothing about her wardrobe attempts to exaggerate glamour or heroism. Instead, her appearance reflects warmth, normality, and family life before the outbreak begins. Even after reaching the military vessel, her clothing remains practical and believable. This realism emphasizes that the global catastrophe has affected ordinary families rather than fictional stereotypes. Karen's appearance continually reminds audiences what Gerry is fighting to protect. The costume design for military personnel deserves particular recognition because of its commitment to authenticity. Soldiers from different countries wear uniforms that accurately reflect their respective armed forces without unnecessary exaggeration. Equipment, protective gear, tactical vests, helmets, and weapons appear functional rather than overly stylized. The military clothing supports the film's documentary-like realism, helping viewers accept the international scale of the crisis. Whether aboard a United States Navy vessel, inside military installations in South Korea, or defending Jerusalem, each uniform reflects discipline, organization, and professionalism. Israeli soldiers, including Segan, wear practical combat uniforms designed for real military operations rather than cinematic spectacle. Their clothing reflects a demanding environment in which they operate while also reinforcing the seriousness of their mission. Following Segan's injury, her appearance changes significantly. The loss of her hand becomes a defining visual element of her character. Yet the filmmakers avoid exploiting the injury through excessive graphic detail. Instead, the bandages, altered uniform, and visible physical limitations communicate both vulnerability and resilience. Her appearance evolves naturally alongside her emotional journey, symbolizing her determination to continue despite devastating personal loss. Scientists and medical personnel inside the World Health Organization facility wear clothing that immediately establishes their professional identities. Laboratory coats, protective equipment, gloves, masks, and sterile uniforms reinforce the importance of science during humanity's struggle for survival. Their costumes contrast sharply with the damaged clothing worn by survivors encountered throughout the story. This visual difference subtly communicates that the laboratory remains one of the few places where order and rational thinking continue despite the chaos consuming the outside world. Perhaps the film's most distinctive costume and makeup achievement involves the infected themselves. Rather than portraying traditional zombies covered in decaying flesh, exposed bones, and exaggerated wounds, the filmmakers chose a more restrained and unsettling approach. The infected retain much of their human appearance because transformation occurs almost instantly after infection. Pale skin, bloodshot eyes, visible veins, minor injuries, and frantic physical movement become the primary visual indicators of infection. This design choice makes the infected feel disturbingly familiar, reminding audiences that each monster was an ordinary person only moments before becoming consumed by the virus. The makeup department carefully balanced realism with horror. Every infected individual appears slightly different depending on how recently infection occurred and what injuries they sustained during the outbreak. Some display fresh bite wounds. Others have facial injuries caused by violent collisions, while many simply appear physically exhausted and emotionally empty. This variety prevents the infected from looking identical and reinforces the impression of a rapidly spreading global disaster affecting millions of unique individuals. Hair and makeup also contribute significantly to the film's sense of realism. Survivors gradually appear more tired, dirty, and physically worn as the story progresses. Faces become covered with sweat, dust, and minor injuries accumulated through constant travel and exposure to danger. These subtle details communicate exhaustion more effectively than dialogue ever could. The audience sees the physical cost of survival reflected directly on each character's appearance. The screenplay of World War Z is one of the film's most fascinating achievements because it successfully transforms an unconventional source novel into a suspense-driven cinematic experience. Max Brooks' original book was written as an oral history, consisting of interviews with survivors recalling the zombie war years after humanity had regained control of the world. This structure worked brilliantly as a novel, but posed enormous challenges for filmmakers attempting to create a traditional feature film with a clear protagonist and a continuous narrative. Instead of trying to reproduce the novel scene by scene, the writers created an entirely original story that borrowed the book's worldwide scope while constructing a focused character journey centered on Gerry Lane. Although this decision divided some fans of the novel, it resulted in a screenplay that functions exceptionally well as a tense, fast-moving blockbuster. The screenplay immediately establishes one of its greatest strengths: efficiency. Rather than spending a long period introducing every character and explaining their backgrounds, the script provides only the essential information necessary for audiences to connect emotionally with Gerry Lane and his family. Within the opening minutes, viewers understand that Gerry is a former United Nations investigator who has chosen family life over dangerous international work. They also see the close relationship he shares with his wife Karen and their daughters. This brief but effective introduction allows the outbreak to begin almost immediately without sacrificing emotional investment. The audience cares about the family before the world falls apart, making every later decision feel meaningful. One of the screenplay's most effective techniques is the gradual release of information. Gerry rarely receives complete answers. Instead, every location provides another small piece of a much larger puzzle. South Korea introduces clues about the infection's rapid spread. Jerusalem demonstrates the overwhelming power of infected swarms. The aircraft sequence reveals how fragile even temporary safety can be. Finally, the World Health Organization laboratory allows Gerry to connect everything he has learned throughout his journey. This investigative structure transforms a screenplay into more than an action movie. It becomes a mystery where knowledge itself is the prize. Dialogue throughout the film reflects this emphasis on realism. Characters generally speak the way trained professionals would communicate during an emergency. Military officers issue concise instructions. Scientists explain observations carefully without unnecessary technical jargon. Government officials focus on practical decisions rather than dramatic speeches. Even Gerry's conversations remain direct and purposeful. This restrained style helps maintain the film's believable tone because characters avoid lengthy monologues that would feel unrealistic during a global catastrophe. Brad Pitt's Gerry Lane rarely attempts to dominate conversations. Instead, he spends much of the film asking questions and listening carefully to the answers. This is an unusual characteristic for the lead character in a major action film. Rather than proving his intelligence by delivering speeches, Gerry demonstrates it through observation. His dialogue often consists of short questions that encourage other characters to share valuable information. The screenplay therefore presents intelligence as curiosity rather than arrogance. Gerry succeeds because he remains willing to learn from everyone he encounters. The relationship between Gerry and Karen is also written with remarkable restraint. Their conversations avoid exaggerated romantic declarations and instead focus on practical concerns about family, safety, and responsibility. Because their dialogue feels natural, the emotional connection between them becomes believable. Simple exchanges often carry enormous emotional weight because both characters understand that each conversation might be their last. The screenplay trusts the audience to recognize these emotions without requiring dramatic speeches explaining how much they love one another. One of the screenplay's greatest accomplishments is its pacing. From the opening outbreak onward, the narrative rarely pauses for long periods of exposition. Instead of stopping the action to explain every aspect of the infection, the script allows audiences to discover information alongside Gerry. Each sequence introduces new questions before answering previous ones, maintaining constant curiosity. This structure creates momentum that carries viewers naturally from one international location to another without making the film feel episodic or disconnected. Exposition itself is handled with impressive discipline. Rather than overwhelming audiences with scientific explanations, government briefings, or complicated medical terminology, the screenplay provides only the information necessary for understanding the immediate situation. Characters explain what they know, admit what they do not know, and continue searching for answers. This uncertainty strengthens the suspense because neither the audience nor the characters ever possess complete knowledge of the crisis. The screenplay understands that mystery often generates greater tension than excessive explanation. The infected themselves contribute to the screenplay despite never speaking. Their behavior functions almost like a form of visual dialogue. Every encounter teaches Gerry and the audience something new. They react instantly to sound. They ignore terminally ill individuals. They overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers rather than strategy. These behavioral discoveries replace traditional conversations, allowing the screenplay to communicate information through action instead of lengthy verbal explanations. In this way, silence often becomes just as important as spoken dialogue. The film also benefits from strong visual writing. Many memorable moments require very few words because the screenplay trusts images to carry emotional meaning. The traffic jam during the opening outbreak, the infected climbing over Jerusalem's walls, the airplane infection sequence, and Gerry quietly walking past infected individuals inside a laboratory all rely primarily on visual storytelling. Dialogue supports these scenes but never overwhelms them. The screenplay demonstrates confidence in cinema as a visual medium rather than treating every important idea as something that must be spoken aloud. Humor is used sparingly but effectively. The marketing campaign for World War Z was one of the most ambitious and closely watched promotional efforts of 2013. Because the film carried a massive production budget and had already attracted significant media attention due to reports of behind-the-scenes difficulties, the studio faced the enormous challenge of convincing audiences that the final product would deliver an exciting and memorable cinematic experience. Rather than attempting to hide the movie's ambitious scale, the marketing embraced it, presenting World War Z as more than just another zombie film. It was promoted as a global disaster epic that combined horror, action, suspense, and survival into a blockbuster event unlike anything audiences had previously seen. From the very beginning, the promotional campaign emphasized scale above all else. The trailers avoided focusing solely on individual characters or isolated action scenes. Instead, they showcase entire cities collapsing, military operations spanning multiple continents, massive crowds fleeing in panic, and the terrifying speed of the infected. The goal was to communicate that this was not a small survival story, but a worldwide catastrophe affecting every corner of the planet. This strategy immediately distinguished World War Z from many earlier zombie films, which often centered on a handful of survivors trapped in a single location. One of the marketing team's greatest assets was Brad Pitt. By 2013, Pitt had become one of the most recognizable actors in the world. With a career spanning more than 2 decades and an impressive collection of critically acclaimed performances and blockbuster successes, his presence alone generated enormous public interest. Promotional materials consistently featured Pitt prominently, often showing Gerry Lane running through collapsing streets, investigating mysterious outbreaks, or standing before scenes of unimaginable destruction. His image reassured audiences that the film would deliver both emotional storytelling and large-scale entertainment. Brad Pitt also participated extensively in the promotional tour. He appeared on major television programs, gave interviews to newspapers and entertainment magazines, attended international premieres, and discussed both his acting role and his responsibilities as the film's producer. During many interviews, he openly acknowledged the production's challenges while expressing confidence that the extensive rewrites and reshoots had ultimately improved the final movie. His honesty helped counter some of the negative publicity surrounding the production and demonstrated his personal commitment to delivering the strongest possible film. The official trailers played a particularly important role in shaping audience expectations. Rather than revealing the complete storyline, they focused on creating mystery and urgency. Viewers saw cities descending into chaos, helicopters flying above collapsing highways, military evacuations, and thousands of infected racing through crowded streets. The trailers deliberately avoided explaining exactly how the outbreak began or how Gerry intended to stop it. This approach encouraged curiosity while preserving many of the film's biggest surprises for theatrical audiences. Perhaps the single most memorable image used throughout the marketing campaign was the enormous swarm of infected climbing over one another to scale the walls surrounding Jerusalem. This breathtaking visual appeared repeatedly in trailers, television commercials, online advertisements, posters, and magazine features. It immediately became the defining image of the movie because it communicated the infected's terrifying speed and overwhelming numbers without requiring any dialogue. Even viewers unfamiliar with the film instantly recognized that this was a different kind of zombie movie. The theatrical posters also reflected the movie's worldwide scope. Instead of focusing exclusively on individual monsters, many promotional posters featured famous cities under attack, military helicopters flying above devastated skylines, or Brad Pitt standing against enormous scenes of destruction. Several posters showed aircraft, smoke-filled horizons, collapsing infrastructure, and panicked crowds stretching into the distance. These designs reinforced the idea that humanity itself had become the central character of the story rather than a single isolated group of survivors. Television advertising intensified as the release date approached. Short commercials highlighted the film's fastest and most suspenseful moments, while carefully avoiding major plot revelations. Rapid editing, dramatic music, and unforgettable visual effects emphasized urgency and danger. These advertisements appeared during sporting events, popular television series, and major entertainment broadcasts, ensuring that the movie reached a broad mainstream audience rather than only horror fans. Online marketing became increasingly important during the campaign. Official trailers were released through video sharing platforms and quickly generated millions of views. Social media accounts shared posters, behind-the-scenes photographs, interviews, production updates, and countdowns to release. Fans discussed every new promotional image, often analyzing small details for clues about the story. The internet played a significant role in transforming anticipation into worldwide conversation, especially because many people remained curious about how the troubled production would ultimately turn out. Entertainment magazines devoted extensive coverage to movie. Feature articles explored the ambitious production, Brad Pitt's role as both actor and producer, the adaptation of Max Brooks' novel, and the innovative visual effects used to create the infected swarms. Behind-the-scenes photographs revealed large practical sets, military vehicles, and international filming locations, helping audiences appreciate the enormous scale of production long before the film reached theaters. World War Z occupies a unique position within modern zombie cinema because it successfully blends elements from multiple genres while establishing an identity unlike almost any other film about the undead. Although it shares familiar themes with earlier zombie stories, it approaches a concept from a much broader perspective, emphasizing international cooperation, scientific investigation, and large-scale disaster rather than isolated survival. Comparing World War Z with other influential films reveals how it both honors the traditions of the genre and introduces fresh ideas that help redefine audience expectations for blockbuster horror. The most obvious comparison is with the original novel by Max Brooks. While both the book and the film explore the consequences of a worldwide zombie pandemic, they do so in dramatically different ways. Brooks' novel is structured as an oral history, presenting interviews with survivors years after humanity has won the war. Each chapter introduces new characters, countries, professions, and perspectives, creating a detailed portrait of civilization's collapse and eventual recovery. The novel places equal importance on political decisions, military failures, economic disruption, and personal survival stories. There is no single protagonist guiding the reader through the narrative. The film, however, abandons this documentary-style format in favor of a traditional cinematic structure centered on Gerry Lane. Instead of dozens of interconnected stories, audiences follow one character whose journey connects multiple locations around the world. This change disappointed some readers who hoped for a direct adaptation, but allowed the filmmakers to create a continuous emotional narrative better suited to a feature-length film. While the novel offers a panoramic examination of global society, the movie provided a more intimate experience by allowing viewers to witness the crisis through one family's struggle and one investigator's search for answers. World War Z is also frequently compared with George A. Romero's landmark zombie films, particularly Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. Romero is widely regarded as a father of the modern zombie genre, using the undead not simply as monsters, but as symbols representing social issues such as consumerism, racism, class conflict, and the breakdown of civilization. His zombies move slowly, creating tension through inevitability rather than speed. Survival in Romero's films often becomes a psychological battle as much as a physical one, with human conflict proving just as dangerous as the undead themselves. World War Z respects many of Romero's themes, but approaches them differently. The infected move with astonishing speed, turning every encounter into an immediate life-threatening emergency. Rather than focusing primarily on internal conflict among survivors, the film emphasizes cooperation between governments, scientists, military forces, and civilians. Romero often portrayed institutions collapsing under pressure, while World War Z suggests that organized cooperation remains humanity's greatest hope. Both approaches explore society under extreme stress, but they arrive at very different conclusions about human nature. Another important comparison is with 28 Days Later, directed by Danny Boyle. Although technically featuring infected humans rather than traditional zombies, 28 Days Later revolutionized horror cinema by introducing fast-moving, infected capable of overwhelming victims within seconds. The film's bleak atmosphere, intimate storytelling, and emphasis on psychological survival influenced countless later productions. World War Z clearly builds upon the concept of fast infected, but it dramatically expands the scale. Where 28 Days Later focuses primarily on Britain and a relatively small group of characters, World War Z transforms the outbreak into a truly international disaster involving multiple continents and global institutions. The visual style of the two films also differs significantly. Danny Boyle employed digital cinematography, desaturated colors, and abandoned urban environments to create an intimate, unsettling atmosphere. Marc Forster instead embraces polished blockbuster visuals, extensive visual effects, and massive crowd simulations to portray the overwhelming scale of worldwide collapse. Both films succeed brilliantly, but each aims to create a different emotional experience. One emphasizes loneliness and isolation, while the other emphasizes the terrifying interconnectedness of modern civilization. Another natural comparison is with Dawn of the Dead, particularly Zack Snyder's 2004 remake. Snyder's film also features fast-moving zombies and intense action sequences, making it one of the closest stylistic relatives to World War Z. However, Dawn of the Dead remains primarily confined to a shopping mall, using its limited setting to explore relationships among survivors. World War Z continually shifts between countries, airports, military installations, refugee camps, and scientific laboratories, giving the audience a much broader perspective. Snyder's film concentrates on survival from moment to moment, while World War Z focuses equally on discovering a solution to the outbreak.